before we go to this afternoon's topic, is there anyone who has any questions coming from discussion group they'd like to ask?
Another question when we're talking about like the way to achieve lasting happiness, we tried to kind of define what suffering meant, and the question about physical pain came up. So it's kind of difficult to deal with that.
Good question. And this is something we're going to, of course, go into in more detail in the coming days. But the Buddhist answer is that, the short answer is, pain is mandatory, suffering is optional. For us, suffering is mandatory. It doesn't have to be. So we can distinguish between pain and suffering. That's the short answer. The long answer is still coming.
So the question was regarding happiness. So is it a translation of a Sanskrit word, happiness?
Happiness, yes, sukha. Sukha.
But are you satisfied with the translation? Because sometimes we say that translation in English from a Sanskrit word.
Yeah. Sometimes you hear I think it's Greek word, eudaimonia, is used. So again, the challenge with using the word happiness is we immediately think pleasure. And of course it's not that. So sometimes people talk about a state of inner well-being. Is sometimes used, and I think the Greek word is eudaimonia.
Is suffering and happiness binary? Like, is the absence of one in the presence of another vice versa?
So is suffering and happiness sort of a binary?
Only two things.
Yeah. I mean, this is for us now. It seems to be, because for us, pain is suffering, pleasure is happiness. So that's sort of a binary. I mean, you could introduce neutral, maybe, in the equation. But what we have briefly seen, and we'll talk much more about, of course, is when we use the word happiness, we're talking about this genuine happiness. So this would be a state completely free of not only what we think of as suffering, but of dukkha. So, we have to be clear about, so what we can say is that how we look at suffering and happiness, what we're talking about is a state beyond both of those.
But in that case, so the causes of happiness and the causes of suffering are different. If they would act exactly opposite each other, shouldn't the absence of causes of suffering be ultimately the causes of happiness, instead of having new causes?
But again, we have to really understand what do we mean by suffering and what do we mean by happiness. We're not just talking about unpleasant experiences, and we're not talking about pleasurable experiences. And as we're going to see in our presentation that's coming up, is that by eliminating the underlying causes of dukkha, then that is what leads to this state of genuine happiness. But then there's genuine happiness also, there's a little bit more to be said about that as well. So this is all still to come.
Yeah. So in our group discussion, it came a question as if we develop conviction,
Conviction?
that our happiness does not come from those worldly things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will we still be motivated enough to accomplish our goals?
So if we understand, the question is, if we have conviction that the source of happiness is not any of those things out there, will we have a conviction to strive for goals? I would suggest that depending on what our goals are, they may radically be different goals. And then we'll have even more enthusiasm to strive for those goals. Because we will have that conviction But now we sort of strive for goals and we think, well, okay, maybe it'll give me something, I'm not sure. But if we really gain conviction in this, you will probably find that the goals may shift quite a lot, and then you'll have really strong conviction, enthusiasm to strive for those goals, because you'll understand that these are really worthwhile goals.
Are pleasure and happiness against each other? In the sense that should you not...
So remember we said, is pleasure against happiness? I think you mean by the word happiness, genuine happiness? Is that what you mean? Yeah. So remember we just said there were two types. And we said it's not a choice. That in fact if we strive for genuine happiness, then our pleasure will increase.
Right.
So we can have our cake and eat it as well.
Right. Okay, so it's not like a stoic approach where you're trying
No, in fact that's, if we have that, we've completely misunderstood.
Right, so it's not in line with stoicism. It's not in line with being stoic.
No, I mean, well, it depends again what you mean by stoic, but stoic is like, then we've sort of, we've gone astray.
Right.
We haven't got a good understanding.
Right, okay.
Yeah, one of the things that we're going to talk about more later is, you know, sometimes people, when they look at these spiritual paths, they think, oh, I have to, you know, it's like a hardship or something that I have to endure. If this is our idea, we've completely missed the point. I mean, one of the things, like this question here about conviction, is by understanding, we will have actually a lot of enthusiasm. We'll be joyfully doing these sorts of things, no matter how difficult they seem.
Along that path, while you're trying to go down that path, you've been raised with different conditions. So obviously your parents, your siblings, your partners aren't of the same school of thought.
Aren't of the...
Same school of thought?
Maybe yes, maybe no.
There's some friction there often. How do you sort of...
Again, the friction often comes because you're not playing their attachment game.
Yeah.
But that's good friction, because actually you're going to be helping them to overcome that attachment. But then what's important there, and this is also still to come, is what's called skillful means of how to approach that and not go, I'm right, you're wrong. This is not a good approach. But more is still coming. We're going to talk a lot about this.
Okay.
Regarding these two types of happiness, it may sound as a tricky question, but let's take like two persons, like they have like this genuine happiness, right? And then you have one of them that has the pleasure things and the other one has not. Would you say that the first person is happier than the other one?
No. Absolutely not. Because again, even if one has a lot of painful experiences, they'll have no suffering. No suffering.
Okay.
So you'll find, and it's hard to talk about if you haven't had a little bit of that experience, is that's, I mean, when the more we approach that genuine happiness, that inner well-being, any little sort of pleasurable experiences will be like, so what? So what? I mean, it's really like, it's hard to explain really, but it's like, if it's there, okay, if it's not, it's okay, doesn't matter. Both completely okay. And in some ways, actually, as I mentioned this morning, if we have too much of the pleasure, then we get complacent. We think, oh yeah, I'm already there, I don't need to do anything more. And then we may actually get stalled. Whereas if we're faced with difficult things, we'll realise, well, okay, there's still a little bit more to do here. And it's actually, you'll find the more we get into this, you'll actually need to look for these difficult situations to go further. So in fact, the person who has more difficult will be more happy. Will be more happy because they can progress more and they can benefit others more.
Isn't there like a dangerous situation in which you generate and truthful, and you cannot get to that utopia or expectation, and you're striving for feel happy the whole time, and you start to misunderstand the things.
Yeah, but I mean, again, we're not searching for some pleasurable state that we can be in 24/7. That's got nothing to do with genuine happiness. And if that is, we're just going to suffer. We're going to get frustrated, and we're just seeing pleasure as happiness. So it's not so much about what happens to us, it's how we respond to what happens to us. That's the key point. And yeah, again, more is coming on this topic as well.
Do you have an example of pain which doesn't lead to suffer? Not physically, because physically I can...
Well, I'll use a simple example. So maybe some of you have been here in India just before the monsoon down on the plains when it's 45 or 50 degrees. And of course we're there. What do? Oh, it's so hot, I'm suffering so much, it's tormenting me. Yeah? But then we go into a sauna where it's double that, it's 90 degrees, and we go, oh, that's so nice, so wonderful. Twice as intense sensations, yet one we go, it's so much suffering, the other one you go, wow, that's so nice. That's a sort of simplified example, but you know, you sort of get my point.
Pain, like as you mentioned, pains often teach us invaluable lessons.
Sure.
But why Buddha did not say so? Why Buddha himself did not say so?
We did. What's this? This presentation.
Okay.
So in our group we weren't sure what dukkha or suffering actually is, but you gave an example. But we were wondering, how is suffering all pervasive?
How is it all pervasive? Again, it's all pervasive, not in the sense that we're having unpleasant experiences all the time. It's all pervasive in that in every single moment there is a potential for suffering to arise. So in that sense it's all pervasive. It's always there, that potential for suffering. And that potential is there because our mind is contaminated by these mental afflictions. So as long as we have mental afflictions in our mind, then there's always a potential for suffering to rise in any moment in our life.
So when the Buddha said that, does that mean there was the diagnosis?
Yeah, that's the underlying illness. Yeah.
Okay.
The mind which is free from concerns.
Free from concerns as in the 8 worldly concerns? Yeah.
Is it close to animal state of mind?
Sometimes we hear that some spiritual traditions talk about go back to the childlike mind because it was innocent. But actually this is what's called a pre-trans fallacy, is that it's not like the baby was in some pure state and we got contaminated. It's just that a baby doesn't have the cognitive ability to create a lot of problems yet. So we don't want to go back there. We want to go forward and transcend suffering.
Later, you mentioned eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. That's sometimes a word, a Greek word that's used.
Well, I was going to ask, that Greek philosophy was, if I remember correctly, the pursuit of the individual happiness.
Correct.
I wondered if there's opportunity cost versus pursuing of Sorry, I wondered if there was opportunity cost.
Opportunity
cost.
Cost.
Yeah, so the pursuit of their happiness reduces our ability to try and pursue happiness and leave suffering in others. And maybe this is going to touch on this later, but I just want to understand the balance and maybe the achievement of our own happiness internally allows us to achieve happiness.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and of course we're going to discuss that in some detail later. But the short answer is that actually to pursue one's own happiness, the best way to do that is to pursue others' happiness. But more will come later. So it's not like a trade-off, actually.
Does that then mean that love and oneness comes close to some love and oneness is
oneness? What do you mean by
like
oneness?
when you don't differentiate between you and the other person objectively, the external experience and you yourself.
Right. And so the question is, love and oneness is...
Can that be the answer to lasting happiness?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is all still coming. The short answer is to find that genuine happiness is to overcome our distorted view of reality. And at the deepest level, that distorted view is this sense of separation. So when we overcome that, that state is in the nature of loving kindness and compassion. But more is to come.
There are lots of autistic kids.
Artistic or autistic?
Autistic.
Autistic? Autistic?
Yeah, kids with autism. Many of them are intellectually disabled.
Well, some of them are intellectually very bright, I think, autistic kids.
This is like a very
Spectrum.
wide spectrum.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and on the sad side.
On the...
On the sad side,
What side?
The kids cannot intellectually understanding the problem. They suffer, but cannot understand.
Right, and?
So there's no way for them to learn Buddhism.
Right, yeah. So, of course, this is a system of training our own mind, which we're going to talk about the mind now as a topic for this afternoon. And so, of course, to be able to begin to do that, we have to have a minimum level of mental health to begin that process. And I think this is where modern therapies and psychology can be very helpful to bring people up to that level of mental health to be able to then use some of these. And also what we find is that now, more and more, a lot of the therapies that have been developed are drawing on a lot of Buddhist ideas, for example, mindfulness specifically, to really help that person to achieve that level. Then they can be more self-sufficient. Like, I've talked to a number of people who, suffering from like ADHD or depression or so forth. And of course, in the past, they just throw a few drugs at the person, which, okay, but it's not really going to solve anything. But now then, the sort of skillful therapists may need to use a little bit of drugs to bring people up to a sort of some level, and then they're using a lot of these sort of therapeutic approaches to improve their level of mental health so they can let go of medication and then bring the level of mental health up to a level whereby they can start to really utilise a lot of these things that we're going to be talking about in this course. So if we really want to simplify, we can say that the role of psychology and psychotherapy is to make an unhealthy ego healthy, and Buddhism is then to take that healthy ego and to transcend it.
Unfortunately, there are so many kids, those medications or psychology therapy fail.
Sorry, I didn't catch.
There are so many kids being failed by modern
Correct.
medicine.
And part of the reason is exactly the topic we're going to do now. So I'll give you the short answer and then we'll talk more about this coming. Is actually, I'll give you the answer as we go. It makes more sense. So your answer will come very shortly.
Okay.
So this afternoon's topic is we're going to talk about the mind. Because what we've seen this morning is that what the Buddha discovered is that not only is the source of suffering within our mind, the source of happiness is there. So really we need to transform our mind. So we need to work with our own mind. So therefore, if that's the key central point to all of this, it would be a good idea to know what do we mean by mind. So that's the topic for this afternoon. when we use the word mind, this is a translation of the Sanskrit word chitta. And here there are a number of terms that are used. And when we speak very generally, the three terms, or the three words, mind, consciousness and awareness, are same meaning. However, in certain specific contexts, these words, consciousness and awareness, can take on quite a different meaning. So we need to be careful when we see these words. Particularly this word awareness is heavily used, seems a very popular word that's used by many translators. And unfortunately, different translators translate different Sanskrit terms with the same word awareness. So what we end up with is this word awareness used to have many different meanings, and it can get very confusing very fast. But here in this afternoon's topic, when we're talking very generally, then the word mind, consciousness, awareness, same meaning. And before I introduce the Buddhist theory of mind, I'd like to first briefly introduce another theory of mind so that we can compare a little bit. And of course, in the modern world, there are many theories of mind, but one theory of mind that is widely accepted in the scientific community is what's called the scientific materialistic theory of mind. And so, of course, scientific materialism is a branch of science that asserts that everything in the universe can be explained in terms of matter and energy. And so here then, in scientific materialism, the mind is considered either to be the brain, a function of the brain, or what's called an emergent property of the brain. So in this system, this theory of mind, the assertion is that things like thoughts and emotions are nothing more than electrical signals and chemical flow in the brain. Nothing more than that. And that therefore matter and energy is really the fundamental thing in this universe. And to quote from a physicist, Sean Carroll, he says, "We are collections of atoms operating independently of any immaterial spirits or influences. Under naturalism," and that's more or less the same word as scientific materialism, "there isn't much difference between a human being and a robot. We are all just complicated collections of matter moving in patterns, obeying impersonal laws of physics in an environment within an arrow of time." And within that view, then, it's often one of the more popular variations of that, of course, is that the mind is what's called an emergent property of the brain. So to explain that, I'd like to read a little bit from Alan Wallace, who's a long-term Buddhist, but also he studied physics at Stanford. And he says the following: "Contemporary scientific materialism asserts that objective reality is composed entirely of matter and energy, and that reality has been that way since the origin of the universe. In this scientific system, awareness, or in other words, mind or consciousness, is an emergent property of the nervous system, and the nervous system is composed entirely of matter and energy. Scientific materialism offers quite a plausible account of the evolution from unconscious atoms and energy to the emergence of the human mind. This theory states that at some point early in the history of the cosmos, if we accept the Big Bang theory, atoms formed into molecules. These molecules had new properties. A molecule such as water, H2O for instance, has qualities not found in either of its atomic components of hydrogen and oxygen, either individually or collectively. To take some of its obvious properties, water is wet at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it freezes at 32 degrees, and salts will dissolve in it. These attributes, not found in the individual atoms of a water molecule, are therefore called emergent properties of these molecules. So this is this idea of emergent property, is that when things start to come together to form more complex configurations, new properties emerge. For example, hydrogen is not wet, oxygen is not wet, but we stick them together and we form a water molecule, then we have the property of wetness emerging, coming to get into existence. And then he goes on, he says, organic molecules then combine to form single-celled organisms as well as viruses, which cannot be classified with certainty as being either living or non-living. In the former, life emerged as a property of the molecules that made up the cell. Eventually, the first cells with a neurosystem, such as Hydra, evolved. And from this point, we may speak of the emergent property of primitive awareness. Human consciousness, with all its complexity, the theory concludes, is merely an emergent property of a far more sophisticated configuration of matter and energy, the human body, which evolved according to the laws of natural science. So this theory is saying in the process of evolution that when we particularly get to the point of some very primitive neurosystem evolving, then from that we can talk about the emergent property of consciousness, of mind, of awareness. And therefore, human mind or consciousness of awareness is simply that emergent property of a far more sophisticated configuration of mass energy, the brain and the nervous system in the body. But then what are some implications of this view? So we'll continue on. He says, now let us return to the water molecule. If the configuration of its individual atoms is destroyed and the atoms separate, the unique properties of the water molecule do not go anywhere. They simply vanish, for the organisation of matter and energy from which they arose is no longer present. So going back to the example of water, if the hydrogen and oxygen atoms separate, the property of wetness doesn't go anywhere, it just vanishes because we no longer have that configuration of matter and energy. And then he goes on, he says, this is equally true, according to scientific materialism, of the emergent property of awareness, human or otherwise. When the neurosystem ceases functioning, materialists say, awareness disappears without a trace. The implications of this view concerning the nature of death are clear. Individual awareness vanishes and only a decomposing configuration of matter and energy remain. So one of the implications of this theory of mind, of course, is that our mind came into existence when the brain and nervous system started to function at the beginning of our life, and that at the end of this life, when the brain and neurosystem stops functioning, the mind will cease to exist. So that's one of the implications of this view. And back to this question from here earlier, one of the quite tragic consequences of holding this view is the pharmaceutical industry. Because if we really believe that the mind is an emergent property of the brain, then all mental illness can be explained simply in terms of imbalances in the brain. So therefore, if we want to fix any mental illness, depression, anxiety, whatever, all we need to do is throw some pharmaceuticals at the brain to fix those chemical imbalances. Absolute disaster. There's not one pharmaceutical, I think, that cures any mental illness. All they do is suppress symptoms. At best, at worst, they create a whole lot of other problems. So this is one of the tragic side effects of this view of scientific materialism, of the mind is the brain, is that All of our mental processes get reduced to simply brain activity, and therefore we can fix mental illness by simply fixing imbalances in the brain. So that is, I think, not a very good state of affairs, and we can see what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry these days. So just to go on a bit, so this view, of course, is saying that the mind is either the brain, a property of the brain, or emergent property, which means that this view is based on the theory that everything is made up of matter and energy. But if we are holding this view, then we really need to know what do we mean by matter and energy, because that's our view of the world. Everything's matter and energy. And so Alan Wallace says the following: the above theory is plausible and intelligently conceived. Its proponents go on to insist, however, that it is true and that incompatible theories are unscientific. If we are to adopt that theory as objectively true, we should have a sound understanding of what is meant by energy and matter. But here we run into problems. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman asserts that modern science has no notion of what energy is. And while scientists believe almost unanimously in the existence of atoms, their views vary widely as to what atoms are. Some noted physicists believe they are mere properties of space, others contend they are sets of relationships, and still others, included noted physicist Werner Heisenberg, deny that they are material things at all. Particularly when venturing into the realm of quantum mechanics, we encounter statements by leading physicists that not only energy, but the entire array of elementary particles are simply constructs of our theories. Thus, physicist John Gribben even suggests that subatomic particles did not exist until they were observed in this century. And also, one of the challenges with this view is to try to explain how conscious experience arises from brain activity. And so far, they haven't come up with any good answers. And here, quoting again another scientist, a cognitive scientist, Donald Hoffman, he says the following. Now Huxley, and he's talking about Thomas Huxley, who was the noted biologist in the 19th century, who was a contemporary of Darwin, he said, now Huxley knew that brain activity and conscious experiences are correlated, but he didn't know why. To the science of his time, it was a mystery. In the years since Huxley, science has learned a lot about brain activity, but the relationship between brain activity and conscious experiences is still a mystery. And it's so much of a mystery, and it's sometimes called the hard problem. How does conscious experience rise from matter and energy? And it's even where now some very noted physicists are saying, well, actually, there's no problem because there's no such thing as conscious experience. It's an illusion. I mean, that's an easy way to rid yourself of the problem, but I mean, how can we say there's no such thing as conscious experience? I mean, it defies, I don't know. I mean, when I heard that, I thought, what? Really? Okay. So that's very briefly one view of the theory of mind within scientific materialism. Of course, we're not suggesting all scientists accept this view. In fact, quite a number of scientists do not accept this view. Before I introduce the Buddhist theory of mind, I'd just like to quote from a couple of physicists. The first one is Andre Linde, who's a professor of physics at Stanford University. And he says the following. The current scientific model of the material world obeying laws of physics have been so successful that we forget about our starting point as conscious observers and conclude that matter is the only reality and that perceptions are only helpful for describing it. But in fact, we are substituting the reality of our experience of the universe with a conceptually contrived belief in an independently existing material world. Is it possible that consciousness, like time-space, has its own intrinsic degrees of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete? What if our perceptions are as real, or maybe in a certain sense even more real, than material objects? The standard assumption is that consciousness, just like time-space before the invention of general relativity, plays a secondary subservient role, being just a function of matter and a tool for the description of the truly existing material world. But let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions. And then again, quoting from this cognitive scientist, Donald Hoffman, he says, "As a conscious realist, I am postulating conscious experiences as ontological primitives, the most basic ingredients of the world. I'm claiming that experiences are the real coin of the realm. The experiences of everyday life, my real feeling of a headache, my taste of chocolate, that really is the ultimate nature of reality. I believe that consciousness and its contents are all that exist. Space-time, matter and fields never were the fundamental denizens of the universe, but have always been from their very beginning among the humbler contents of consciousness, dependent on it for their very being. So while neuroscientists struggle to understand how there can be such a thing as first-person reality, quantum physicists have to grapple with the mystery of how there can be anything but a first-person reality." And one more quote here is that, of course, physics is really about describing things within space-time. But here, one up-and-coming theoretical physicist, Nima Akani-Hamed from Princeton, is challenging this. He says, many separate arguments, all very strong individually, suggest that the very notion of space-time is not a fundamental one. Space-time is doomed. There is no such thing as space-time fundamentally in the actual underlying description of the laws of physics. That's very startling, because for what physics is supposed to be about is describing things as they happen in space and time. So if there is no space-time, it's not clear what physics is about. That's why this is a hard problem. That's a serious comment. So let's now briefly introduce the Buddhist theory of mind, and of course we're going to continue to expand on this in the coming days. But just a couple of presentations, short presentations today, just to help us to get a little bit of a picture of the Buddhist theory of mind. First is definition. So one simple definition of mind in Buddhism we often see is that mind is that which is clear and knowing, or sometimes translated as clarity and awareness. And in this two-word definition, the first word is describing the entity of the thing we're defining, and the second word is describing the function. What does this thing do? For example, a simple definition of fire is hot and burning. So what is the entity or nature of fire? It's heat. What does fire do? It burns. So what is the entity or nature of the mind? Is that the mind is clear or has clarity. What does the mind do? The mind knows, it is aware. So let's have a look at both of those words in a little bit more detail. First, this word clear or clarity. So what does this word clear or clarity mean then? This word clear or clarity implies two things. One is that the mind is not physical. So in the Buddhist theory of mind, the mind is not the brain, it's not a property, it's not a function of the brain, it's not an emergent property of the brain. So in the Buddhist theory, then there are two types of phenomena in the universe. There is the physical phenomena, which is matter and energy, and then there's the non-physical, which is mind. So unlike scientific materialism, which subsumes mind into the physical realm, that mind is physical, that it's a brain or function of the brain or emergent property of the brain, the Buddhist assertion is that the mind is not physical. And the other meaning of the word clear or clarity is that because the mind is clear or has clarity, therefore things can appear in the mind. Thoughts, emotions, images, memories can appear. A little bit like the idea that because a mirror is clear, reflections can appear in the mirror. Because the mind is clear, we can have thoughts, emotions, and memories and so forth appearing in the mind. But then what does the mind do? Is that the mind knows, it is aware. The mind engages in those appearances. So this is a very simple definition of mind. And so what I'd like to do now is give a couple of presentations on mind from different perspectives to get a better picture of what we mean by mind. But is there any questions about that before we move on to that?
What you shared about the scientific materialism paradigm, are you reading from a book, or is that just your notes? Or
Yeah, I'm reading from, well, I was reading a lot from Alan Wallace, and then I was quoting some physicists and so forth, yeah.
You say Alan Watts?
Alan Wallace.
Wallace.
Alan Wallace, yeah. Yeah, he's a long-term Buddhist, but he also studied physics at Stanford University many years ago.
Could you share?
He does a lot of collaboration with the scientific community. He's a bit like, you know, the Dalai Lama is very keen on coming to a common understanding of mind and nature of reality, actually. And I was quoting from one physicist here, Andre Linde. Actually, it's another physicist I'm thinking of. He's a neuroscientist, actually. Anton Zeilinger is from University of Vienna. And he's a lot into quantum mechanics. And they've had a number of discussions together, Anton Zeilinger and His Holiness Dalai Lama, about reality. And it seems like their view of reality is very similar. And actually, the Dalai Lama has commented that he finds it amazing that physicists can come to more or less the Buddhist view by running experiments. And Anton Zeilinger is amazed at how Buddhists can come to this view by meditating. So they're both amazed at how they're basically coming to the same, more or less the same conclusion from two very different approaches. So that's very interesting, I find.
When you say, on one hand, it means clear, but then things can appear in the mind, that sounds like it's contradicting each other.
So, again, the word clear or clarity means that things can appear in the mind. Does that mean we see them clearly? No. Like, for example, let's use an example. Water is clear by nature. But if we have a lot of sediment in the water, we can't see much. But the water's still clear by nature, even though we can't see. So it's like that.
The mind is similar with the soul.
So the question is, the mind is similar to the soul. So for me to answer that, I would have to ask you, what's your definition of the word soul? How you define that word?
My mind is the same.
Well, then it's the same.
Okay.
But, and we'll touch on this this word soul a bit in a few days' time. Generally, when I'm giving these explanations, I don't tend to often use like soul, ego and things, because probably in this room, if I use the word soul, there's probably at least 10 different ideas of what that word means, and then we just get confused. So what I'd rather do is present Buddhist concepts, and then you, from your side, can see whether that matches your idea of soul or ego or whatever.
Your definition of mind reminds me.
Not my definition.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't make that up.
You presented
This definition, yeah.
Yeah, remind me of the phrase mental power.
Mental power.
Yeah. No connection.
I don't know what that means.
So in the same way that the description of mind has been given, which is entity and function being clarity and awareness.
Yeah.
What would that be for human beings?
For human beings.
Human.
What if the human being is the entity that you're asking?
I mean, what is the one function of human beings that if you're aware, they'll stop being human beings? Like, what's the property? How would you define? Or is a human being equal to the mind?
Well, no. But actually the word sentient being in Tibetan is sem chen, which is literally a mind haver.
Right.
So a sentient being, or a human, or we can say also a human, is someone who possesses a mind.
Just a vehicle.
That's a sort of simple not a definition, but that's the word that's used in Sanskrit. One of the words used in Sanskrit and Tibetan is a sentient being is someone someone having a mind.
Awareness.
Mind, consciousness, awareness, yeah. Exactly.
What's that word?
Sem chen in Tibetan. In Sanskrit, I can't remember exactly. Sem chen. Sem is the Tibetan word for chitta, for mind. So that's the Tibetan word. And chen means to possess. Sem chen is a mind possessor.
During our introduction, you were told that even an ant has a potential to be Buddha. Is an ant a sentient being?
Is a what, sorry?
Is an ant?
Yeah, the short answer is, according to Buddhism, yes. The long answer is still to come in 2 or 3 days' time.
Same question for the mind and the soul. Is the mind similar to the spirit?
Again, what's your definition of the word spirit? I think the word spirit can be used in many different ways. So I'll present the Buddhist theory, and then you see if your understanding of the word spirit matches that or not.
Is it mind is like a mirror which reflects things like it is? Is it true?
Well, that's the idea of clear or clarity, is that it means that things can appear in the mind. Thoughts, emotions, memories can appear in the mind, in that sense.
So the thoughts which appear in my mind, does it mean that in my whatever mind or brain, whatever? So do I perceive this is that the mind is working? Whatever thoughts are appearing in my memory. Okay, so do I understand that this is the mind which is working?
Well, what else would be working?
The connection between clarity and entity and function. Clarity.
Yeah. So these you can't have them separate, of course. These are not two separate things. This is describing mind. So, although we can talk about a mirror being clear or having clarity, we can't say a mirror knows or is aware of anything. Whereas the mind, of course, has that function of knowing, of being aware.
Is that true? The best way to understand
This is what, sorry?
Is that true? The best way to understand the mind is through meditation.
So this is coming now.
This definition only talks about the two parts of entity and function.
So it's very simplistic.
Clear and knowing.
Correct.
So where do the thoughts and emotions come from?
Coming. So let's go there. to do now is expand on that a little bit and look at the mind from a number of different perspectives. One perspective we can look at the mind is in terms of objects. So with the mind, we can be aware of different types of objects. We can be aware of visual objects, sounds, sensations, smell, taste. But also, of course, we can be aware of mental objects like thoughts, emotions, memories, images. So because there is 6 types of objects we can be aware of, we can talk about what are called the 6 consciousnesses. So we can talk about the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. But of course, we're not talking about 6 separate minds. We've only got one mind. These are 6 aspects of that mind. So the aspect of our mind that can perceive visual objects, we call visual consciousness. And the aspect of mind that can perceive sounds is auditory consciousness, and so on. And the aspect of mind that can perceive, engage in thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth is mental consciousness. So sense consciousnesses are what's called non-conceptual, meaning they contact their object directly. So, for example, the visual consciousness is directly perceiving colours and shapes. Whereas the mental consciousness is conceptual. Meaning we understand, we know things through concept. For example, we look here and the visual consciousness sees a collection of colour and shape. And then the mental consciousness interprets that collection and goes, I know what that is. That's a bowl. So we know that through conceptuals. So that's one way of looking at the mind in terms of the different types of objects we can experience with the mind. So we have this presentation. Any questions there before we move to the next one?
Can you just repeat about the different consciousnesses?
Yeah, so we can experience 6 types of objects. We can experience visual, sound, smell, taste, tactile, and mental objects like thoughts and emotions. So therefore we can talk about 6 consciousnesses. So the mental consciousness is that aspect of the mind that perceives, engages in thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. And the sense consciousness are those aspects that perceive the sense objects.
But with the story of the ball, you
Yeah, so let's say we look there, then visually we see just some colour and shape. We don't know anything, we just see colour and shape. But then the mental consciousness interprets that colour and shape and goes, I know, that's a bowl. So we know that through concept. The mental consciousness is conceptual. We can also talk about the mind in terms of levels. And here, when we talk about different levels of the mind, often in Buddhism we identify 3 levels. we can talk about the coarse mind, which is the mind that is active now. Sometimes called coarse consciousness. And this would be equivalent to, in psychology, what's called the psyche. This level of mind in Sanskrit is often called vijnana. And of course, within this level of mind, and that's the mind that's active now, the mind that is thinking, experiencing, and so forth. Within that, of course, we have also a whole bandwidth of levels. And then often within that, in psychology, we talk about, often they divide it into two. What's called conscious and subconscious. So there's a lot of things going on here that we're not aware of because it's below the level of our threshold. We're only aware of some mental activity up here. There's a lot of things going on we're not aware of. What's called sometimes subconscious in psychology. But in Buddhism, what we're trying to do is we're trying to... then we can talk about this sort of threshold. And in Buddhism, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring that threshold down. Because the more we can bring it down, the more we're aware of everything going on in our mind. But within Buddhism, we're trying to bring this threshold not just down here, which I think in psychology we have a very limited ability in how far we can bring that down. But within Buddhism, we can bring it right to the base and even way further. And we can get down to what's called the subtle level of mind, which, of course, you will never hear about in psychology.
So coarse could also be gross, I guess.
Yeah, gross. Yeah, coarse, gross sometimes, yeah. And so we can talk about a more subtle level of mind, a deeper level of mind, sometimes called substrate consciousness. The Sanskrit term here is alaya vijnana. Alaya means like the foundation or basis. So this is the basis of the vijnana. So of course the coarse mind we have now is a mind that is conditioned by our environment, our society, by our body. But this more subtle level of mind, called substrate consciousness or alaya vijnana in Sanskrit, is really the ground state of the coarse mind, the ground state of the psyche. It's the level of mind from which all mental activity arises and dissolves back into. This level of mind, of course, is much more powerful. In fact, even here, if we can bring this threshold down, we're really making our mind much more calm, more clear, more focused, more powerful. But if we can bring it right down here, and that's what we're doing in this shamatha practice that I've talked a bit about, is in the concentration practice, we're trying to gain access to this level of mind. Because this level of mind, the ground state of the coarse mind, is very calm, very clear, very focused. And if we can use that level of mind in our Vipassana practice, we can really progress on the path. So in Buddhist traditions, then when we talk about samadhi practice or shamatha practice, what we're doing is we're gaining access to this level of mind and then using that in the spiritual path. But then we can talk about one even deeper level of mind. And I've run out of space there, so we'll go up here. And that's called the very subtle mind. It's the deepest level of our mind. Sometimes this is called primordial consciousness. In Sanskrit, this is jnana, which basically means we're just taking the VI prefix off here. So not to confuse this with jhana or dhyana. That's concentration. That's not this. This is jnana in Sanskrit. This also goes by a number of different names in Buddhism. Sometimes it's called the clear light mind, primordial mind, pristine awareness, many different names. This level of mind is the ground state of consciousness in general, and this level of mind is atemporal and non-local. Atemporal means it's beyond time. Time and space emerge from this level of mind. And non-local means it's not individuated. Meaning you can't say, my very subtle mind and your very subtle mind. That just doesn't make any sense. But of course that doesn't mean we're all one. So this is not talking about collective consciousness. This is some other thing. We don't really talk about collective consciousness in Buddhism. So this is not collective consciousness. This is beyond time. Time emerges from this level. Time and space emerge from this level. This is the level of mind that we're trying to gain access to in what's called Tantra or Vajrayana in Buddhism. That level of practice. Because if we can gain access to this level of mind, we can accelerate the path dramatically. And we'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later when we have a brief introduction into what's called Tantra or Vajrayana. So what we can see here is we can talk about a number of levels of mind, and the deeper the level of mind we gain access to, the more powerful it is. So that's a brief introduction into levels. Of course, we're going to talk more about this in the coming days, but any questions about that before we move to the next presentation?
What's the difference between collective consciousness and this one? Like, it sounds quite similar.
It sounds similar, but collective, well, again, it depends how you define the word collective consciousness. Because this is also beyond duality. And collective, the idea of collective consciousness is still a dualistic concept.
But this is a consciousness that everyone has?
Yeah, but again, see, the thing is, we're trying to understand this with our conceptual dualistic mind. Impossible. This is beyond the intellect. You will never figure this out with your conceptual mind. In fact, if you were to gain access to that, experience that and come out, and someone says, please explain to me that, you'd go, you couldn't explain it. It's impossible.
That's interesting. I'm just trying to understand it in my mind. So would number 2 kind of be where our manifestations happen?
No, all manifestations happen here. This is the source of manifestations. When manifestations arise, they arise here. They arise in these levels. There's no thoughts.
Yeah, okay. And then number 3, you know, like sometimes you can get a really strange thought just like cross your mind, it's just so random, complete curveball. Would that be from number 3? Because you're like, where did that come from?
It's because what's happening here, this is all in the coarse mind, is what's happening is that there's a process beginning and we're not aware of it, and our threshold may be right up here, so there's a whole process going on, and then suddenly it pops its head above there and we go, oh, where did that come from? Because we're not aware of what's preceded. So if we can bring this threshold down, and we can do that, I mean, in psychology, I think there's very limited capacity to move it down, very limited. In Buddhism, we can move it right down through the shamatha practice. And the more we bring it down, the more we'll notice the beginnings of all of these things. We'll see where they're coming from. I can't hear, sorry, you have to speak up.
What do we mean by beyond time and space?
Time and space emerge from this level.
Is that where deja vu comes from? Like the feeling of deja vu?
From here? No, definitely
from the
not
subconscious?
there. Definitely not from there.
From the subconscious?
Probably from here.
Can you explain number 2 again?
Yeah. Well, again, this is a brief introduction. I mean, this is what we're going to look at later. But basically, here is we are going even beyond the conscious and subconscious. We're going to a deeper level of mind that we can only access this through this shamatha practice. But more will come later. I need to talk about other things to explain more than that.
So ultimately, in number 2 and 3, you're not aware of what's happening?
You are 100% aware here. 100%. For the very first time in your life. Now we think we're aware, but of course what happens is there's a lot of stuff going on we're not aware of, no? And then suddenly something comes from, I don't know where that came from, you know?
Are these objects level correlated to like thoughts of the brain, right brain, left brain, stuff like that?
No idea. I think certainly Alan Wallace is very keen, like Dalai Lama, in doing work with the scientific community to, particularly in meditation, when people trying to gain access to that, what's happening in the brain, you know, if anything. And what I've seen is that some meditators who really can develop, I'm not sure exactly what level they're talking about, but some level like this, where they basically bring the mind down into a very subtle level. And basically, you know, even when we're asleep, there's a certain level of brain activity happening all the time. And I remember one of these meditators who was hooked up to one of these one of these machines to measure brain waves. When they first did it, he went into this state where basically the brain activity flatlined. And then the scientists was thinking the machine's broken. It's broken. Because they've never seen that before. Even when someone's in deep sleep, there's minimal brain activity. But this meditator got to this state where basically there was more or less zero brain activity. And for them, that was like, you must be dead. So that is an interesting area of research, I think.
Is that...
Can you explain what does a laya mean?
A laya means like foundation, basis. So a laya vijnana means the foundation, the basis of the vijnana. That's why we have this substrate term. Substrate is the basis.
Where is the knowledge of past lives?
Knowledge. Well, they're still coming. Let's leave it because I'm going to talk about that later. Okay, so let's move on to the next presentation. So we can also look at the mind in terms of how the mind functions. And here the mind is usually divided into two, what's called primary mind and mental factors. Primary mind is simply the raw experience of the object. Mental factors is all the other things which determine what type of experience we have. So in these mental factors, which is really Buddhist psychology, we often come up with a list of 51 mental factors. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, there are what's called 26 mental afflictions. So 26 of the 51 are mental afflictions. So attachment, anger, jealousy, craving, resentment, anxiety, so forth. So it seems like in terms of our mind functioning, we have a lot of these mental afflictions often present. And this is a whole topic itself, but I'd just like to briefly mention a couple of other mental factors which are very important that we're going to be looking at in some more detail in the coming days. One, of course, is the mental factor of mindfulness, which we've already touched on briefly in terms of shamatha practice. So again, mindfulness is the mental factor, our ability to hold, to focus on an object. So of course, in the shamatha practice, we are strengthening this mental factor of mindfulness to improve our ability to focus, to concentrate. Another mental factor that we're going to be looking at in more detail is a mental factor of feeling. And when you see the word feeling in Buddhism, it doesn't mean emotion. Feeling is a translation of the Sanskrit term Vedana. And this mental factor is simply experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And the reason this gets a lot of attention in Buddhist psychology is that's where we often get into a lot of trouble. Because it's on the basis of pleasant feelings we have attachment, unpleasant feelings, aversion, the whole mess starts from there. So this one gets a lot of attention, and we'll be looking at that in more detail in the coming days. Another mental factor that gets a lot of attention is the mental factor of intention itself. And we'll be looking at this. So this is really about motivation. It's our intention behind our actions, which is very important. And we'll be looking at this in more detail tomorrow. So there are many other mental factors, but in terms of how the mind functions, in terms of experiencing, again, primary mind simply is the raw experience, and then all the mental factors fill in that experience and determine what type of experience we have of the object. So this is a whole topic itself, in Tibetan Buddhism called Lo-Rig, Minds and Awarenesses. This is Buddhist psychology, so it's very helpful to understand how the mind functions by studying that. Then someone asked about where does the mind come from, or where do thoughts come from? So let's have a look at that. Where does the mind come from? Of course, thoughts, as we saw, really come from that more subtle level of mind, emerging into the coarse mind and then dissolving back in. But the mind itself, where does that come from? So we can begin by asking, where did this universe come from? And of course, one of the most prevalent theories is the Big Bang theory. But then we can ask another question, where did matter and energy come from? So although we can talk about a beginning of this universe, I think when it comes to talking about the beginning of matter and energy, there's a different answer, because one of the fundamental principles in classical physics is conservation of mass energy, which means you can't create it, you can't destroy it. So if you ask the question, according to classical physics, when was the beginning of matter and energy, they'd have to say no beginning. Because if they say it began at Big Bang, they would be saying something comes from nothing, which violates fundamental principle of classical physics. So similarly, we can ask a similar question, when did our life begin? And of course we can say at birth, or technically the Buddhist answer would be conception, and we'll talk more about that later. But then when we talk about what about the beginning of mind, then just like in classical physics, Buddhism has a similar theory of conservation of consciousness. You can't create it, you can't destroy it, you can only transform it. So when you talk about the beginning of consciousness or mind, like classical physics and matter and energy, you'd have to say, according to Buddhism, there was no beginning. So therefore, one of the implications of the Buddhist theory of mind, of course, is the mind didn't begin at the beginning of this life and it won't end at the end of this life. It means there was a prior life and there will be a future life. So that's one of the implications, of course, of the Buddhist theory of mind. Whereas, of course, the scientific materialistic theory of mind is very clear. Mind began when the brain started, the mind will stop when the brain stops working. But that Buddhist is because in Buddhism the mind is not the brain, and the mind is beginningless and endless. But here we have to be very clear about causality. So we have this idea of substantial cause and cooperative conditions. So let's use a simple example of causality in the material world. What is the cause of the plant? Where did the plant come from? Then, of course, the answer is the seed. So the seed is what's called the substantial cause. The seed is what transforms into the result. But for that transformation to happen, we also need cooperative conditions. We need soil, sunlight, water, fertilizer, because without those cooperative conditions, that seed will never become the plant. So therefore, what caused the plant is the seed. What contributed to that was the soil, sunlight, and so forth. So, similarly with mind, what is the cause of the mind we have now is the mind we had a moment ago. But for that mind a moment ago to produce the mind we have now, we need conditions. And those conditions can also be external things. For example, maybe the mind of a moment ago was very calm, but then we saw someone we didn't like, and now we have a mind of anger. So what caused anger? And often we go, they did. They caused my anger. But that would be like saying the water caused the plant. The water was a necessary condition to have the plant. The person was a necessary condition for anger to arise. But what caused the anger is the seed of anger that was there in the previous moment. That was the cause of anger. And when that seed of anger met with these conditions, that manifested as anger in the present moment. So we have to be very clear not to confuse these two. Otherwise, we tend to point to things outside of ourselves as the cause. They made me angry. They're the cause of my suffering. No, they were a condition. The cause was there in your mind. So a similar idea here in terms of causality and the mind. And then just reading a little bit from Alan Wallace again on this point here. He says, according to Buddhism, consciousness is regarded as an event or continuum of events, a little bit like the seed and the plant, rather than as a thing moving through time. So even if we look at a plant and a seed, we can say there's something moving through time, but actually there's just a continuum of events happening, slow transformation. So similarly, the mind. And he says, energy also can be best understood as an event, and even matter, which appears to us so thinnish, dissolves into a matrix of events when it is closely examined. So Buddhism is not arguing that the mental realm is just as real and tangible as the physical world appears to be. Rather, it asserts that the substantial appearance of the world of physical things is deceptive, and that both physical and mental phenomena are best understood as interdependent events. This implies that no phenomenon exists with its own intrinsic independent identity, because each phenomenon depends on others. In Buddhism, this is a key concept. And so this is something certainly we'll be spending quite some time on a little bit later in this course, this idea of interdependency. It's a very important concept in Buddhism. Any questions on that? There's just one more thing I wanted to briefly cover before we finish this afternoon.
Yeah, I didn't understand what you explained before, the primary mind.
Right. So here we're looking at the mind in terms of functioning, how we experience things. So when we experience things, one way of understanding that is to divide experience into two components. I mean, of course, these are not two separate things. You can't have them separately. They'll always come together. So when we experience something, we can talk about simply the raw experience, contacting the object, and then we can talk about all the things that fill in what type of experience we have of that object.
What do you mean by raw experience? Like just, for example, you
Just see
a ball, you see a
ball.
ball and you say it's a ball.
No, not even say it's a ball, you just see bowl. But then together with that, let's say when we look there, our mindfulness is not good, we're distracted, then we won't really experience anything because even though we're looking there, our experience we don't not even notice the bowl because mindfulness is sort of absent. Or maybe there's a mental affliction here of anger there, so when we look at the bowl we're angry when we're looking at the bowl, for example. So this is filling in what type of experience we have. This is a huge topic. Buddhist psychology.
So the primary mind is preconceptual, right?
Yeah.
Daniel Kahneman talks about fast thinking and slow thinking brain, which is impulsive reaction and rationalized thought. Is that sort of similar to what you're talking about here?
There's something extra we can add to that.
Okay.
Which it'll come, but we need to talk about a few things before we can answer that.
Would it be then like the five sense consciousness, the primary mind?
No, so this can happen at a sensory level and a mental level. So we can talk about seeing the bowl, but we can also talk about experiencing a memory or a thought or an emotion. Both cases here. Right, last point is we talked about nature of mind briefly. And we already talked about, the conventional nature of mind. What is the conventional nature of mind? Is the fact that the mind is clear and knowing. That's its conventional nature. And we come to experience this directly. We come to see clarity and awareness directly through the shamatha practice. So we realize this through shamatha practice. Now, of course, our mind is not very clear. It's full of dullness, full of distractions, full of thoughts. It's like now we're looking at murky water, trying to see the clarity of water. It's murky. Not much is going to happen. So actually this is a very good analogy. Our mind is like a water full of sediment. We don't see any clarity there at all. So how do we see the clarity of water? Is we put the water down and let it settle. And the sediment sinks to the bottom. So if we do shamatha practice, our mind settles, and then we see directly this clarity. We see directly this knowing quality of the mind, which these are pretty obscured to us now. Then we can talk about what's called the ultimate nature of the mind, and this is talking about how does the mind exist. And this brings up this huge topic of emptiness, which we're going to spend a whole day on later. Basically, emptiness here, very simply, is saying the mind is not existing independently. That like everything else, it's interdependent. And we come to realise this through Vipassana practice. So we come to realise the conventional nature of the mind simply by looking at the mind, and we see the clarity in knowing. But then we need to investigate that mind to come to see that it's not something that exists independently. So we realise the ultimate nature of the mind through Vipassana practice. But of course more about that will come a lot of detail later. So that's very briefly a few things about the mind, and of course we're going to expand on a lot of these things in the coming days. Any last question, because we've run out of time there? Last question.
There's a conservation, there's a law of conservation for law of conservation.
Conservation?
Yeah, but also mind is also emptiness.
Correct.
Sounds like a contradicting.
Sounds like, but it's not. In fact, they're two sides of a coin, and we're going to talk about that. Okay. Just a couple of comments and then we'll close. First, of course, for tomorrow, if you want to read it, prepare a little bit for tomorrow's class, we're going to go to the second noble truth, the truth of causal origin of suffering. So we're going to be covering page 4, 5, 6 and 7. So 4, 5, 6 and 7. And also, we are going to be using this suffering and its causes chart. Did everyone end up getting one of these? Is there still someone who hasn't got one of these? So we're going to be looking at this suffering and its causes chart, so if you might like to have a bit of a look at that as well. So that's the topic for tomorrow. One last point here is that if there are any of you who want to ask questions, but maybe they're of more personal nature, then there is an opportunity to come and see me privately to ask questions. So there's a list here that I'll leave on the table. So starting tomorrow, after lunch every day, there are 4 15-minute slots, starting at 12:45, where you can sign up to come and see me. But again, this is not just to have a casual chat. It's only if you've got something important to ask, and it's of a more personal nature and you can't ask it in class. Then you can put your name on the list here, and then a little bit later I'll explain where we're going to meet. So I'll just leave that on the table here. So now, of course, we're going to take a break, and at 5:30 you're going to do a meditation with Felipe, and you're going to do a meditation about the first one here, this idea of the conventional nature of the mind, to come to a little bit of a taste. What do we mean by clarity? What do we mean by knowing? What do we mean by this continuity of mind? So you'll start to sort of reflect and look at that this afternoon, Felipe. And then this evening, you'll be doing a meditation about these 8 worldly concerns to better appreciate them. And then tomorrow morning, before breakfast, In the shamatha practice, you'll move to focusing on the abdomen, the next stage of the breath practice, and also doing a little bit of loving kindness practice as well before breakfast. So that's the meditation sessions that you're going to have this afternoon, this evening, and tomorrow morning. So that's it for today. So take a break, come back at 5:30, and then I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.